Just need to, my mouth's getting a little dry here. And this plays out over time. Again, partisanship becomes the major perceptual lens, along with ideology, by how the public thinks about the urgency of climate change. And what's interesting from this graph, from the more recent Gallup poll, is that there's always been this partisan divide between Republicans and Democrats about how much they worry about climate change, right? But what happened after the Clinton administration left office, suddenly Republicans have a lot stronger opinion leader cues from the Republican administration downplaying the urgency of climate change. And they no longer have cues from the administration in power that it is a serious question, it is a serious problem. The other key difference is that 2001, right? 2001, it was so powerful, it was so, the war on terror became such a dominant meta-narrative for American politics, right? That the environment generally dropped in terms of levels of public concern, right? It displaced a lot of things. Also, the economy also kind of tanked and it didn't do as well. So the economy became more of a priority. All right, and then when it comes to interpreting major events, you still see the same partisan divide, right? So this is the difference between Gallup asked people, thinking about the increase in the number and strength of hurricanes in recent years, do you think global warming has been a major cause, a minor cause, or not a cause of the increase in hurricanes? And what was interesting about the last hurricane season is it received media saturation, right? Along with the Challenger disaster and the Pew polls of most widely those issues across history since they've been taking the poll that people have paid closest attention to. The Challenger disaster and September 11th are the only issues that people report paying closer attention to than Hurricane Katrina, right? So there's saturation coverage about Hurricane Katrina. It was on people's minds, right? But still there was this partisanship played this very strong perceptual lens in interpreting the events, right? Part of it was that Democrats had people like Al Gore, Bill Clinton, and Jimmy Carter making this case that this was a product of global warming, right? And then that provided a cue for Republicans to say, no, it's not. All right. Now, so the nature of the public means that the nature of how public makes up its mind about these complex remote issues means that the public is very susceptible to probably one of the biggest trends in society going on right now, right? And this is the struggle for cultural authority. By which basis do we decide collective decisions in society? Do we decide collective decisions based on science, or do we base it on other forms of knowledge, which might be religious values, or just, say, popular wisdom or common sense, right? And in many cases, one of the big trends is this growth of think tank science, right? And so on the conservative side, in many cases, conservatives see the implications of science cutting against the preferred policy options. Many people on the left also see it this way, right? But they haven't developed kind of the institutionalized system of think tank science quite as the right? And what they use is they play on the popular channels of science to turn these popular channels against science itself, right? So this is Steve Hilgartner, who's a sociologist of science at Cornell, wrote this influential paper in 1990 in Social Studies of Science, where he talked about how scientists use popular science not only to educate the public, but also promote their careers, win grants, and often try to persuade their colleagues through the mass media. What's interesting is that what he didn't talk about in this article is that the opponents of science have now used these popular channels against science itself through things like Michael Crichton's novel on climate change. The entire intelligent design movement has taken advantage of these downstream channels of science, right? Never doing the peer review work, but attacking, the theory of evolution through press conferences, op-eds, and through books. And the other thing about this larger cultural trend is that it's amplified by the extreme fragmentation and polarization of the media and the polarization of audiences, right? So all these statements are false, right? But if you go to Christian or conservative news outlets and websites, right, they're true, right? These are statements that are held to be true. If you go and you read actually even articles and opinion pieces at Fox News, they call embryonic stem cell research junk science, and they argue that the only stem cell sources you need are from adult stem cell sources. They also dispute the consensus view on global warming. As many of you know, obviously, they argue that there's so many holes in evolution that by default intelligent design must be true. All these statements are false through the view of the scientific community are generally held to be false in the mainstream media, but because of the polarization, the fragmentation of the media now, where anyone can select themselves into a like-minded news source, right? This kind of amplifies the impact of misinformation. All right, so, and then finally, the third aspect of the media environment that's changing, or that cuts against the idea of popular science in educating the public informally through the science, is that there's always a baseline level of attention to scientific issues. Usually it comes from the science pages, it comes from the news beats. In fact, most science issues start in what people have called kind of this primordial soup of non-attention. This is media attention to stem cell research historically, right? So when it was adult stem cell sources and it was relatively non-controversial, low levels of media attention, mostly from science writers writing scientific backgrounders and detailing new studies, right? Suddenly 1998 is a major focusing event. Embryonic stem cells are extracted for the first time. Science calls it the discovery of the year. There's political contest in 2001 with Bush's decision. September 11th happens, media attention declines, but then the election and the death of Christopher Reeve and Ronald Reagan. What happens is that for most scientific issues, whether it's stem cell research, whether it's plant biotechnology, where the peak in attention came with the Starlink corn affair in 2000, 2001, but started in 1999 with a lot of social protest. If it's climate change, where the historic peaks in attention have been the 1992 Rio Conference on the Environment, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, and then the 2001 decision by Bush to withdraw from Kyoto. When science gets the most amount of attention in the news, it's when science is redefined as political, right? It's not when science, there's always this baseline level of attention from science reporters, but it's when political reporters, and this is the Human Genome Project, when the White House, there was this big, the race to map the human genome, and then Clinton had the conference at the White House, and then low levels of attention since then. And then this is intelligent design. Not only when political reporters start paying attention to the issue. I like to refer to this graph as teach the controversy that we created. But what you see about coverage to challenges to evolution or the creation science debate or to intelligent design is this huge spike in attention in 2005. And this is actually based on a piece that Chris and I wrote in the Columbia Journalism Review evaluating media coverage. But not only do political reporters start paying attention to the issue, but the issue becomes now a product of the opinion pages. And it's really on the opinion pages where you see the image of science morphed and a lot of the contest over what is valid science. And this is based on analysis that Chris and I did for this Columbia Journalism Review piece, where we looked at the opinion pages of the two major national newspapers, and we said, what percentage of the opinion articles, letters to the editor, editorials, and columns assert that ID is supported by scientific evidence? Well, at the two elite national newspapers, not many, right? But in the so-called evolution battleground states, and I didn't do the Columbus Dispatch because being in Ohio, I thought it was too politically sensitive, being an untenured faculty member. But you can see that this is really where scientific, it's on the opinion pages that really various claims running against scientific consensus are really made. So not only intelligent design, but you have people writing on the Wall Street Journal opinion page, the Washington Post opinion page, challenging the consensus view on climate change, right? So what happens is that when these issues get the most amount of attention in the mainstream press, right, is not when it's focused on the technical side of the science. It's when the issue becomes overtly political. It transfers news beats from science writers who do a great job covering the science. Science writers are really good, and they usually focus, the way the news peg for science writers becomes the release of a new scientific study at Nature or Science or a major journal, or the technical backgrounder saying, you know, beyond this zigzag of new studies, what does this all mean, right? Science writers are great, and the most professionalized area of journalism. Political reporters, on the other hand, when they start paying attention to a scientific issue, that's when it receives the greatest amount of attention. But they don't think about it in technical terms, right? Their expertise is in the politics of the palace, right? And they apply the same framework to a story about stem cell research or climate change that they apply to coverage of elections. And that's the strategy frame. Who's ahead? Who's behind? What tactics are they using to win? And what's left out is oftentimes the scientific context. In fact, it gets worse in that political reporters go with the he said, she said form of journalism that just carefully balances the two sides in the claim, even if one side does not agree with the consensus view. And the other thing that's lost in this type of in this transfer across news beats is that science writers sometimes have trouble figuring out what's the news peg for talking about the big policy questions. And Chris and I are working on a piece for Columbia Journalism Review. The reason I like working with Chris and writing for the Columbia Journalism Review is we're able to engage with journalists on these areas of research that I otherwise would publish just in a journal article and they may or may not see, but it raises a dialogue about these questions, right? There's an overwhelming tendency to define what is news in science by the release of new study. And what that means is that, for example, in the hurricane case, when the studies came out in Nature and Science, after those studies are released, media attention to the issue drops, but it's also very difficult to move forward and talk about, well, what are the big policy options in terms of thinking about coastal development, thinking about carbon dioxide emissions. And the other thing that's lost in this type of transfer across news beats beyond just the information distortion and this discussion of policy options is there's really little room for discussion of ethics in news coverage. Journalists don't like it because in some cases it challenges the objectivity norm, right? Every time you write about the ethics of stem cell research, the letters to the editor page lights up. Same thing with intelligent design, right? But it challenges the objectivity norm. So what they do is they relegate discussion of ethics to the opinion pages in editorials, op-eds, letters to the editor. But oftentimes the quality of the ethics coverage is not very good. Okay, so what can be done to wrap up? I think understanding this concept of framing, right? How the public uses frames to sort through complex issues, but also how frames can be used to move public opinion in directions that might be preferred policies, or to raise interest, motivation for more information, technical knowledge, right? Or a greater sense of urgency. On climate change, right, the frame that has, this is Der Spiegel actually, going back to 1986. This is the earliest image I can find, but the trend has been over the last 5 or 6 years is to take these climate-related impacts and really dramatize them, right? They've moved since 2000 beyond a careful balance about whether global warming is going on, now to some distortion and moving ahead of the certainty of the science and thinking about the linkages to hurricanes, thinking about other areas in terms of thinking about, in all these different climate impacts, the levels of uncertainty rise above that first claim about whether global warming is happening or not and human activities are contributing to it. In some ways, it's hard to say, but I think the calculation is these type of images, both from environmental advocates but also journalists, especially at a place like Time Magazine that has more of an opinion orientation, is that these type of images will create a sense of urgency. But I think what's happened over the last 5 years, and it's hard to tell, again, I haven't done research on this directly, though I know George Lakoff says that he has, cognitive linguist at Berkeley, is that people have become somehow habituated to these threat scenarios. Right? It's not the threat. They've kind of tuned out these threats, right? And they no longer really create a sense of urgency. If you look at the public opinion polling, levels of worry about climate change since 2001 have dropped. Part of that is the Bush administration, part of that downplaying the issue, but part of that also is September 11th. But it's hard to say what's going on. But it seems to be what's going on now is a move away from the threat scenario and a reinterpretation around the issue in terms of morality, right? And reinterpreting issues, this is a big issue for the Democratic Party. I'm not sure whether they'll ever solve it or not. I'm not sure whether they're talking about it right or not. But talking about the moral consequences of a policy issue, right, mobilizes a lot of people, both on the left and the right. You can talk about moral consequences both in secular terms, but also in religious terms that play to evangelicals. So probably some of you saw the coverage in March about an evangelical coalition that wants to do something about climate change, right? Talking about the moral duty as Christians to think about future generations, but also to think about the developing world, for example, that might be hardest hit, and also the fact that the Bible teaches that humans are supposed to be stewards over nature. But Al Gore also uses the moral frame now in promoting his book. He says, recently he was quoted in the press this week saying, I think to the fact, I'm now a grandfather, I'm also a father, George W. Bush is a father, we should be concerned about the consequences for future generations. And the National Ad Council has a series of ads running now, right, where the dominant interpretation of the ads is thinking about the moral consequences for your kids. And this one ad called The Train, I think, is especially, I find this is without any data or testing it, but this train is an interesting example. You have a 30-something male talking about, why should I care about global warming? For those of you who haven't seen it, it's not going to affect me. and there's a rushing, he's standing on train tracks, and there's a train heading towards him at full speed, right? And he steps out of the way of the train at the last minute, and the commercial ends with a small child just behind him being hit by it doesn't show him being hit by the train, but the implication is that he's smashed by a train, right? Again, it fits with this moral implications of doing nothing, right? And not being worried about passing the buck on to next generations. And that mobilizes a wider segment of the public, both on the left and the right. The other interpretation, and this is one of the reasons I think that one of the reasons that Chris's book, other than being very well written, very well researched, is that he hit on this narrative, this frame about public accountability, right? And in the book he argues that we need to hold Republicans in power accountable for the abuses of power, right? And this whole situation with NASA and the so-called muzzling of James Hansen, and now then at NOAA, also seem to resonate, right? That's another way to reinterpret the global warming issue around this idea of it's not about the scientific uncertainty, right? Maybe it's about the moral consequences, but it's also about public accountability. Why should we allow such an important issue be handled by special interests? And why should we allow them to get away with it? And then finally, this idea of economic innovation, right? Economic progress, along with social progress, is one of the other dominant interpretations that the public has about science. And this is this idea that we're falling behind other countries in thinking about alternative energy sources and thinking about innovation, right? So the Prius is one of the great examples of this, right? So our automakers don't really have a hybrid car, but the Japanese do. What does that mean about our international competitiveness? This argument is being made. How persuasive it is, I'm not sure. But one of the interesting things about Prius is that it's also for the very elite and maybe people on the liberal side given celebrity endorsements, it's a signal of social status, right? So if you can get people to drive hybrid cars because they think it's cool and they're early adopter of an innovation, that might be one way to mobilize some people. But finally, public accountability can also cut two ways, right? Outside of this struggle for cultural authority and the push from conservatives, a lot of people on the left are concerned about the privatization of science, right? This idea is science serving the public interest or the private interest? And the Korean stem cell affair, because it was contained to Korea, it didn't play out as much as here. But after the Korean stem cell affair, there was a lot of articles that run, a lot of scrutiny about, can the peer review process be trusted, right? So the New York Times has run investigations or articles critical that the peer review process is failing. And then on plant biotechnology, a lot of people on the left, they play up the short-term environmental and human health risks. But really the driving concern is this idea of who controls the technology and who does it benefit, right? Again, another issue of public accountability. And in California, since Proposition 71 campaign, which was sold to the public not about science, but rather about this idea of social progress leading to cures and it's good for the economy of California, after it passed, it was successfully attacked in the courts around this public accountability interpretation, right? Not whether it was morally wrong or morally good, but rather, who's going to watchdog the scientists and how they handle this money, and they're just going to use it for their own self-serving interests. And that played on a lot of LA Times ran editorials, talking about this public accountability theme, right? That there needs to be some type of mechanism to hold scientists accountable for handling this money. Okay, so framing is important, but also good news coverage, solving this problem of the transfer across news beats, this idea that when a scientific topic does receive its widest mass media attention and reaches the mass public, it's not defined in terms of the technical nature of the science, but it's defined as a political game, or it's defined in terms of moral consequences on the opinion pages, right? How do we get beyond that? One way is, can we rethink what science news is? In some ways, there's an entire industry built around publicity for the release of a single study. But oftentimes that skews what science is about. It's a constantly moving target. So you have one study released in Health that says one thing, and then the next week another study says another thing. It's this constant zigzag, and context is lost. But defining science news as just about the release of a scientific study also makes it very difficult to move towards the big policy implications for that study. And there was a recent policy report released by the Royal Society in the UK that suggested when a new important study was released in Science or Nature, another leading journal, right? There will be a separate peer-reviewed piece that's released with it that talks about the policy implications. And perhaps, you know, it's interesting, perhaps that's one way to make the policy implications newsworthy. It allows the journalist to get beyond, it allows the journalist to go with something that says, I'm not making this story, but rather this was part of the release of the study, and I'm covering the policy implications and interviewing people about it. And one of the other ways to improve coverage is to increase the specialization of journalists. And part of this cuts against the economic trends in the media and the economic forces. But if the journalists really want to, and the news organizations really want to preserve their watchdog function on institutions, they need specialists that specialize not only in science coverage, but also the intersection between science and politics. And finally, when thinking about overall communication strategy, it's often difficult for scientific institutions to think about framing, right? People say it's too Machiavellian, it's just PR strategy, right? They have to preserve kind of their political neutrality and the appearance of that. And also, it's very important to continue to invest heavily in popular science communication activities and science education, but maybe there needs to be a division of labor within the scientific community. Right? The normal scientific literacy emphasis in science education and popular science education efforts continue on, but also other institutions engage with PR strategists and other types of experts around this ideas of other ways of interpreting issues and reaching specialized segments that moves public opinion or increases motivation for information, right? Or changes attitudes on these short-term policy questions that are so important, such as stem cell research, climate change, and a lot of these intelligent design, for example. Thank you.